I'd like to introduce Dr. Joseph Brownell. Dr. Brownell has recently finished this book, Cortland to the Adirondacks, A Faithful Journey in 1906. He has written a previous book, An Adirondack Tragedy. Dr. Brownell was a professor at SUNY Cortland, and we'll just leave it at that. Thank you much for coming, and we'll talk a little bit about train day later. Sir.
That book needs some explanation. The other book you mentioned is the one I want, and it's out of print. It's been out of print several years. And part of the trouble is where today in 2000 and whatever it is, 15, find a publisher. They used to exist in the woodshed, anywhere. I didn't care where, as long as they knew their business. But I can't find any. Right now, what will be the 4th edition of that book is in a manuscript about that deep. I'm very close to the end, but I'm not close enough to say it's being published in December or whatever because I don't know. Another question to I was going to say the mob, I think I'm talking to the young students again. To the audience is, how well can you hear me from where you sit?
Fine.
I'd rather do this off the top of my head and with my hands free than to do it with a microphone playing games.
Excuse me.
Haven't missed a thing. Okay. The first thing up on the screen right now is something familiar to all of us, a county map of New York State with its 62 counties. We'll throw 60 of them out and just make the point that most of this story is going to go on based on or near 2 of these counties. One of them is familiar to everybody. It's Cortland County with the county seat, Cortland, the city, in red dot. We will mention later on somebody in Shenango County just over to the right and just off the map as far as we're concerned. But we'll leave it at this. Later in the story, we go up to Herkimer County with its county seat, also with its same name for a city, Herkimer the city, and we will be there finishing the story, which starts out down here. Just for curiosity, I might point out, as I will later on, I don't think you see that green dot there, but that's where, from the Depression years, that was where the Brownells had their summer home. My father, my mother, my brother, and that was about it. And we kept going back not only summers, but in the years my father was laid off. And my education from grade 1 to grade 12 took 9 years and 9 communities. We moved a lot. So don't let people tell you you can't move and still get an education. It can be done. I'm not picking on any particular one, by the way. So it's time to talk about the Gillette story. And I think just as we get going here, the best place, first of all, the time span. It all took place in about roughly from 1905 to 1908, the story that we'll open the door on in a few minutes. That's a long time ago. There isn't a soul living in those days that's here now. And even I am happy to say I was born 26 years after the death of Grace Brown. My white hair is some indication of that. Work out the way we do this. I may even use the chair after all. If the when of this is 1906, or 1905, we did start with 110 years ago. The place we will start with, and we have to start somewhere, should be this building which still exists. And a lot of people from Cortland, Homer know it. If you're a little bit hazy on it, it's opposite the side of the street, Homer Avenue, from the hospital, and this way a little bit, right behind Hyde's Diner, I think it's called now. And this was a factory that was built, I'm tempted to say, way back when. If you want to know what it is, they made skirts. Gillette Skirt Company was the formal name of the thing. Now, I don't know, I'm not knowledgeable enough in women's clothing to know whether that's a skirt or a combination skirt and a top, or whether the business grew. This tended to happen, so they got to making whole gowns. I haven't the foggiest idea of what it was, but that was typical of the growth mode of those particular business days. I can see her shoes, but not much more. And that's the way it was at about 1900 to 1906. And that's the kind of product they made, and they had catalogs, and this is from one of them. Now I'm going to take away for just a minute and go back to this, or go to this, and I'll pull it out 2 or 3 times possibly during the afternoon. This is a genealogical chart, and a very partial one. It's missing a lot of data, showing how this particular man, Albertus Gillette, who was a farmer from up in the northwestern corner of the county, and his wife, Harriet Osborne, had a slew of 6 kids, all born between 1848 and 1861. And there they are, 1, 2, 3, and so forth. And it's worth pointing out that Albertus took his family, wife and all the children, west. Go west was quite the thing in those days. And he did it right during the Civil War. I'm a little puzzled at the timing on that, but there may have been a reason. When they got it there, they went first to Iowa, and then they got out west to the Montana Territory. Interesting, they would say to each other, I'm going back to the States, meaning out of the territory back into the nearest state. This man in the middle, right here, he isn't quite in the middle, but under my finger, N.H. Gillette, N, which was really Noah, Horace Gillette, and he didn't like the Noah. So he is either usually known as N.H. by initials only, or N. Horace Gillette was quite common, and at least one of his nephews called him Uncle Ho, but I don't think that was to his face. In about 1876, an interesting thing happened in Portland which isn't very important to us, and yet it turns a page on this story. There were 2 physicians, doctors, in Cortland County at that time. I don't mean only 2. There were 2. And they were men who were extremely critical of the nippy waist corset of the 1800s. Anybody who's seen Gone with the Wind and seen Scarlet laced up from the rear, you wouldn't want that on your daughter, I don't think. But women climbed into it, it was a story. These 2 gentlemen were convinced that it was unhealthy, and they designed a health corset and started making it in McGraw. Then they took it down to New York City, where it was closer to the market and closer to the raw materials, and it really began to boom, and they both gave up medicine. I don't know how good they were anyway, but no matter. And in 1876, the anniversary year of the United States, they sent a letter out to the Montana Territory asking if this one who was turning 21 that year, Noah, or H.N., Horace, whatever, if he would like to come east and join the company in New York City. As the post was never defined, the business end of it or something. Somebody to run the office. He was youthful, ambitious, and he did. He went there and learned the whole business over the next 15 years, and then decided to take his savings and his family and move from Brooklyn up to Cortland County and sort of completed the circle. And when he got here, he started a little factory in the back room of somewhere making not corsets, but skirts. And women's skirts apparently were saleable that way through salesmen or something. And he was doing very well. They kept moving all over town. At one point, he had a little factory on the second floor, opposite of where Kinney's is now. And then he got an even bigger building up where the present building is, only it burned down in 1902. And he rebuilt, and this is what he built. I did have it there. That right there. It's a cinder block building, or a concrete block building, built on the spot, the first in Cortland made that way. And looking at it is interesting because you can, if you knew what goes on there, you could find out a little something. The top two windows, which are screens over the windows, plastic screens, modern device. That's an attic. Go down one level, and that's the floor. You can see the windows there anyway, the boarded up windows, where the machine operators sat and ran at tables. They did the sewing. The next level down was the level where it was mostly business and miscellaneous. This white thing is the cornerstone right there. And right above it, just inside, with a window on each side, is Mr. Gillette's own office, a private corner office. It's an interesting thing that if you look at these windows, something is missing. Right there. Is that coming up on the screen? Yes, it is. And what is missing is a window, because what they built there right next to his office was a walk-in vault, or safe, or call it what you will. A place for the papers of the company, probably checks paid, checks unpaid, maybe cash, who knows. They didn't do a counter cash business as many businesses do, but they would take orders from people who wanted to come and be measured right there, although it was mostly salesmen who came and looked over the stock and then ordered some to take away. Then we get down to the next level down, which is, most of us would say, well, that's the basement level. I'm still not sure what to call it, although it resembles my basement a little bit, in that it's below ground level when you get to the floor, which isn't visible here. But you do have some windows, but the windows are about half the size of the ones just above them. Another one over here, half the size. Then just where there is a blank in the windows next to Mr. Gillette's office, there's another blank down below. That has to be explained with a little diagram, if the diagram can be understood at all, because it's nothing but a sketch I made in the kitchen table. If you look at this, and if you could see beyond the bricks on the inside, this is where everybody was working. That is everybody in our story. We're not interested in the machine operators up on the second floor or the business corner. But right inside is where Chester Gillette, whom we'll come to in a second, had his job, which he got in 1905. And he had a territory just inside this wall here. Deliveries could come with raw materials such as bolts of cloth. The wagon, you backed the horses up, and the wagons came down to this door here, and the door rolled up, and you took the stuff off, and you're on business. Up and down the line, Chester had stacks into which fabrics could go. Most of them, like cotton, were not particularly important fabrics. They weren't as costly, and they weren't as likely to rot just sitting there. But the one that they had built right below the security vault was another one for silk. The silk was extremely tender. It would go off the end of the blow a whistle. And this is the territory, and it's largely imaginary. I know what went against the walls, but I don't know how far out the counter was, the service counter. But it went out somewhere, and probably did not wrap around to block the door. I've been down in that earlier this year, and you can tell it's had a dozen walls all replacing each other, and you can't tell what came first or which was there in the beginning. Just up here, because this is just a thin slice of the building, which is a long building, the rest of that ground floor, or basement floor, was made up of tables. And that's where the girls who worked there would come to the counter, ask the counter man, which would be Chester Gillette when we get to him in a moment, and they would take the material back with the size and other patterns. I've seen people cut patterns out, but I don't know how they do it. Many of you may have done this, and I appreciate a lot of skill that I would never have. But that's what they did for a living. They had shears and not much more. And then they would take that over to an elevator, which is not in sight here, and it wasn't the kind of elevator you'd like to ride on. It was really a rattle trap. But it would take all those up to the floor way up here where the girls on the machines would take those pieces and they'll pre-cut and sew them together into the garment in question. So that's the place that we're talking about, which drew people here. And one of them that they drew, one of the people that was drawn here, he wasn't invited particularly, Chester Gillette. We go back to this diagram. Horace Gillette had a brother, Frank, who was even older, born in 1853. And one of his 4 children were Chester, Hazel, Lucille, and Paul, Chester being the oldest. In 1905, he was 19 years old. I have to stop and think. 21 years old. And he just appeared in town off the train, and he may have misinterpreted one of the friendly things that relatives say when they come to Chicago and visit you, like, come and work in our factory sometime. He may have taken such a remark very seriously, and it wasn't intended. Anyhow, when he came, he was given a job. Mr. Gillette gave a job to any relative. The plant was full of them. And Chester got a job, not supervisory exactly, but it was to run this particular counter where things got, the girls would come up to the counter with the pattern number, and it needs this, this, and this. I need so much of this for size so-and-so. And he'd peel off the right amount. I guess he could do that much right. Sometimes he's a little dubious about that. But there are cousins down the line here, and one of them that may have fooled Chester when he came in the summer of 1905 or late spring was that he rather thought he would have a place in the factory, and he went there to find Gillettes all over the place. The paymistress was Ella Hoag, who lived right next door to him on East Main Street when he finally had his last room here. And if he looked at the doors, if they had labels on them, or if he had taken the time to look at the city directory, and you can go down to the public library and look at it any time, the city directory for 1906. There are several Gillettes alphabetically, which mean, and in dark and larger print. I wonder if they paid more for that. They probably did. One was Mr. Gillette himself, who was president of the company. Then the next was his son, Harold. And Harold was in office, I think he was vice president, and had some other thing, maybe treasurer, but I'm not sure. And there was a third who lived with them in the house on Court Street. Chester wasn't invited to stay at the house on Court Street. But there was a third man whom I didn't list because he isn't one of the sons of Horace. He was the son of Rembrandt. Believe it or not, it was Rembrandt who died early and left this boy orphaned. And from Spokane to Brooklyn, it's a long way. But they gave the boy a ticket, and friendly railroad people saw him through the changes in Chicago and things like that. And he turned up in Brooklyn and virtually joined the family. And he was an officer of the company. Chester was not. He was just head clerk of the parts department. And we keep coming back to that, but we'll leave it again. One thing about Chester was that he was well-traveled. What had I done with some of these? things. I lose these things easily. Guess what? No, it's not there. Anyhow, there was one showing a map showing where in the Pacific Northwest Chester had been. He's worth describing a little bit in terms of what he was or what he may have been. He was now 21 years old. He had been born of Frank, an older brother of Horace, and Frank's wife. She, of course, was the one with the baby. But she's a bit of a puzzle. The two of them became Salvation Army officers and later switched to a faith healing group north of Chicago, Zion. And probably, and he is never quoted as saying anything anywhere. But she is. She has written letters and the like, and I may read, if my voice holds up, I may read one to you later on. She is the one who probably wanted the Salvation Army. She is the one who wanted to join up in Zion. And I think she made most of the decisions. Now, Chester is a boy, the oldest of four. Growing up in the Salvation Army is, I don't know if I would call them street evangelists in those days or not, but they grew up in the Northwest Territories before statehood for most of those states too, where they had lots of lumbermen, lots of ranchers, depending on the town, a lot of booze floating around. That's easy to fight, easy to settle on anyway. And Chester grew up in this environment. Don't know exactly what he made of it or anything. He did have some rich connections. I didn't show it when I had the one sheet out. The mother of this group, Harriet Osborne, was an Osborne. She had a sister, Osborne, who married one of those two doctors. That's why the loop came around, the call from this young man. They were aware of his presence to come for them. Now, he may have also, I know he let two of these younger people carry the sister and one of the younger men when they were of roughly high school age, and in the era when there were no high schools running around most of the time. And they were invited to go to Oberlin College, which ran a prep school sort of as a lower division. And both did very well, and everybody was pleased. Now they got a spot for Chester there. By the way, why Chester? There isn't another Chester in the family. But he was born in 1883 when the president was Chester Arthur. I wonder if that didn't have something to do with it. Might get back to names later on. We'll see. Chester did fairly well in his first year at Oberlin Prep, I'll call it that. But second year, he must have found other things, don't worry about it, other things to do. And they weren't academic. He has a reputation coming east, and we're not sure of the reputation. And I'm curious as all get out, but I'll never find the answer, probably. Anyhow, he wasn't asked back for a third year, where he was due to go, or when he was due to go. So that's why he turned up at Cortland. He'd been here once before working a summer between terms. Now he came back as a permanent staff, and there he is, raring to go. If you've seen the map, and it'll probably turn up out of sequence somewhere else, he had lived all over what we now call the Pacific Northwest, and include Puyallup and all those strange names that existed. Some of them are still strange for us out in the state of Washington, but they think our Indian names are strange too. I'm from Oswegatchie. Chester just swept up the local girls. I don't think he realized how easy it was at first. When he would talk to girls and they maybe had been in this county, and maybe they visited Onondaga County, maybe they'd been to Binghamton. But he'd been all over the place, including the territory of Hawaii, before he came back to go to school. They just did a snow job on many of the women, including the college girls. They were normal school girls then. So, and he didn't find this out quite early enough, but he did in the winter of 1905-1906 meet Billy Brown. Her real name was Grace Brown, but the family called her Billy. And so did the people she worked with. And she's a girl who came from just outside our county, up in that place I had a pen mark once. That was the house that they lived in. And it looks odd right now. My associate and I went up there a couple of months ago, and it doesn't look like that. Somebody in Staten Island, I think it is, has bought it, and I think they had visions of making a bed and breakfast out of it or something, but I'm not sure. It doesn't look lived in, but they're building stacks of, I don't know what it is, along this area right here. But this was the farmhouse of a farm at the high elevations, which is usually not the best soil. But you worked hard and got away with it in those days. But down at the bottom of the valley that this faces, a mile and a half away, it is better soil. But on that particular valley, the Atisco Valley, there is no railroad running, and we were just discovering at the turn of the 20th century that railroads made the great transportation, even for dairy farmers. And they, before long, got to talk about the milk train. Anybody who's lived long enough, I guess I've been partly there, has ridden a milk train somewhere at some time, at some awful hour of the night. I've left Utica at 2 or 3 in the morning and gotten at Carthage about 7. They don't go very fast. They put out a lot of cans, they take a lot of cans in. They don't exist anymore. Milk trucks do this now. They go right up to the barn with stainless steel implements, screw it in and pump it out. It's all different. But this farm was struggling at the time. 9 children. Billy was the middle child. School picture, that not many pictures there, but this is one that has survived. And this is the teacher up in the upper left corner in the doorway. And right next to her is Billy, or Grace. And then Fern Talent over here was Grace's buddy. It's interesting to read her diary from about 1902, because she and Fern sat side to side, and apparently the teacher sat on them quite a bit for talking. Who never talked in school? I think we've all known a little bit of it somewhere. Not us, but it was all the one next to us. And so they made bitchy little remarks about their teacher. Oddly enough, after school was over, about another year after this particular picture here, Billy and this teacher became good friends, even though they were about 6 years apart in age. She married a local doctor who had just gotten out of med school at Binghamton. I had never even known they had one down there, but apparently they did. And this played a part here and there. Now, what happened here is that Grace loved her older sister, Ada. And she loved visiting Ada. I mean, a real visit that would go on for several days, because Ada treated her like an adult. And when you're about 13, 16 years old as a girl, I think you're tired of having your mother saying, "Don't forget to wear your coat," or something like that. Ada wouldn't do that. So when Ada, who had belonged to or married a guy who worked in a cheese factory, who then found a job in Cortland, moved to Cortland and brought her new little boy of about 3 years old with her, and Grace. Possibly as a kind of great babysitter. It isn't totally clear, but Grace loved it. Out of South Ceiling, finally. I don't know if the locals call it South Ave or not, but a lot of people do. Anybody know?
Also the Berg.
The Berg, yes.
Yes.
And the interesting thing about that is that in Grace's diary in 1902, she calls it the Berg. So that's an older one still in South Ave, which might be an outside view. I don't know. But they came to Cortland. And rented a house on Fifth Avenue, which might sound great abroad, but it's down the longest street in Portland, 1 block. Who was the fireman who lived in that house?
Kenny Castor Line.
Castor Lines. I used to take my children up to the Cortland High School for after-school stuff. It was music all the while. I was never a musician, but I loved what they did. And I'd take them home. The back, I don't know how many got in the back of that Beetle, but I don't even want to count and think about it now. I knew where most of them went, here and here. And where'd this last one go? Fifth Avenue. Fifth Avenue. What number? 13. That's the house. I can't believe it. And yet later on, we went to graduation parties there and things like that. So you do make cross paths connections in Cortland, no matter what. Then there was a problem. That's not the same house. That's a different house, as you can tell. There was a problem because back there on Fifth Avenue, something happened, and the first story I got was the little boy, the 3-year-old, died of, let's see if I can remember the name. It was edema something. Edema means swelling, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. Up here, larynx. And in those days, with the material they had, and no ambulances, no big hospitals, and even the local doctor may have been right out of school, they couldn't save him. And I thought, well, this boy's wandered out to the barn, 3 years old. What was I thinking? And got himself rigged up with a rope or something. I finally got, the Browns wouldn't talk for years. I couldn't get an interview, but I got one from Grace's next younger sister, Mary, had daughters, and I got one of them to talk out in Detroit, and she gave me the whole scoop. The little boy had, oh, I didn't bring it with me. No matter. The little boy played with the curtain rod. Now people visualize these big flat things that stick out from the wall. Now this is just a little thin little rod about that long that keeps a curtain stretched over a partial window. And he put them in his mouth. And the mother, I found my typed notes from that conversation the other day, first time I've seen it in 30 years. Her mother would grab him under the arm and haul him around the house, not knowing he had this in his mouth. And that's probably what happened right in Portland, and it didn't come to a climax until they got back for an afternoon weekend, or for a weekend afternoon, way out there in South Ceiling. And he died there. And the parents couldn't bring themselves to spend another night in Cortland. They moved bodily back out into Shenango County. That left Grace with a problem. What do I do now? She could always go back to the house. I don't think she ever would go back to that house, not as a daughter. So she took a room in the Wheeler house. The Wheeler house is an old farmhouse run by the Wheeler family, which in the end, all the land got made over into the Cortland Fairgrounds, I'm led to believe. And the house stood as the widow, Mrs. Wheeler, lived there and took in roomers, and one of them was Grace. And during the winter of '5-6, Grace had visitors, well, I would say one visitor especially. Chester would come in quite frequently. Already he was beginning to show a multiple-sided mind. He would send her, when he heard about the reason she was absent because of the little boy's death, he wrote her a very nicely written letter but I don't think he wrote it himself. I think he did what a lot of us did when we were about a lot younger age. Looked through our old English books and where they gave sample letters of what you can do under certain situations and cover the thing all for your own. I think that's what happened. In any event, during that year of 1905, 1906, we get into 1906, and somewhere around April 1906, and she must have gotten the message about May, she became pregnant. There was no way around it, and Chester didn't seem to care, or maybe he didn't understand it. He talked her in by June into going back home for an unpaid vacation to South Australia. As if, well, she'll get over this like a cold. I don't know if that boy understood anything about things. And, when she came, well, they had talked, but there's no record of the items. They had talked on the front porch of this house, probably, about things to do. And Chester wasn't about to do some of them. Getting married, for example. I don't think he'd even listen to it. Take a trip. But what the trip involved was not spelled out. If it was between them, it was an oral agreement that nobody knows about. When she got home, she started writing letters to him. Some people say they're scolding letters. I think in her position I'd scold too. And I keep thinking I have to look here. It's just as neat as can be, all mailed. Look at the postage in those days, 2 cents for a letter. It didn't go up to 3 until I was aware of it as a little boy. 50% increase. They've gone up a bit since. But this is one of her envelopes she sent, probably 3 letters to every one from him. She went to multiple pages. He often had one-liner, well, one paragraph. And his degree of interest is obviously very low. And he doesn't have the dreaded fear that she had that she'd be left holding her own. One of the lines out of a letter that she wrote is very worth seeing. I stole it in the sense that I isolated the line where she starts to say, I suppose you think I'm to blame for this, and perhaps I am to some degree, but, and after the but comes this. I don't know if it's legible from where you sit or not. That I, by the way, at the beginning of the sentence is characteristic of her longhand. What do they call it now, cursive? And it occurs over and over again, and if anybody thinks he has a real Grace Brown letter or statement, handwritten, give it a good check against things like that I. She just drops it down below the line and lets it go right there. She finally put the pressure on him. How do you put the pressure on Chester, for heaven's sake? Well, she went into town. That's 3.4 miles from the house. She walked. Everybody walked in those days. She went to town, found what we call a public telephone, and that could have been a variety of different ways of doing it. It could be somebody who just lets you use their phone if you pay them something. And she called the factory and asked for Chester. Now he's downstairs, right underneath the office group, and there's a stairway going down from the office section down to that level. So he had to trudge up there, suddenly realizing when he finds out who's on the other end of the line, every ear in the office is listening to what he has to say. So she puts the pressure on to take that trip. And he finally says, all right, but not before the 4th of July. He had plans of one sort for the 4th of July, and he didn't want to give them up. he wouldn't have made much of a husband, I'm afraid. But they did have this plan that the first Monday after the 4th of July, on Sunday night, he'd take the Lehigh Valley up to DeRuyter. The reason for meeting in DeRuyter is that it's the closest town on the railroad to where she lived. And at least there was, believe it or not, a stagecoach going from South Ott over to DeRuyter. Didn't look very comfortable. I think it felt every stone in the road. And most roads in those days were not paved. And they got there. She met him in the morning. He stayed overnight in the hotel. She met him in the morning, and then they made separate tracks to the railroad. I don't know who insisted on this, of not being seen together. So she got in an early car. By that I mean up forward a bit. He got into the tail end car, the last car, where there were 2 college girls or normal school girls there. Josephine something, and I can't remember the other. They talked all the way up, and the idea of up is to get from this region here up to the main line of the New York Central, Canastota. Have I got the name right? Okay, I didn't read that as an A on the end when I looked at it lightly. Then they switched. Well, while he was with those 2 schoolgirls, they were going to the Adirondacks. They talked about that. Chester had never been there before. So they gave him some ideas about nice places, how they were going to 7th Lake on the Fulton Chain Lakes, and they were going to go up Black Bear Mountain pretty soon. And Chester, I don't know what he told them. He may not have told them anything. But when they got to Canastota, he and Grace both took the New York Central local into Utica. You have to go to Utica to get anywhere in this story. That's part of the hassle. Utica is down there, but to see that line going up north from Utica, yeah, there's a branch off from that goes through the Adirondacks that took all the customers. There were no automobiles to speak of, and certainly no roads. Everybody went by train. And when they got to Utica, they did 2 things, I think. They walked the streets at night. This is probably the largest city Billy'd ever been in her life. They bought 2 postcards. You could buy them for a penny apiece in those days. And mailed them for a penny apiece. So it really cost you 2 cents. Each bought a postcard. He bought one of a pretty lake. She bought one showing downtown Utica. The thing that would catch her eye as something that was different. And next morning when they got up, Chester said, we're taking the train, which leaves about 1 o'clock in the afternoon, up into the Adirondacks. There had been no minister, no justice of the peace, no nothing up to this point. So she's just following along, doing as she's told, and it's getting pretty bad. Chester also that morning took down to a local, I don't know the street address, but a local laundry, 2 shirts and 1 handkerchief needed cleaning. And then arranged for them to mail them ahead to Old Forge. Now, he'd never heard of Old Forge till he was talking to those 2 girls the day before. So, this is a laundry slip. I don't care if I get them back or not, but they're just for cursory examination. Should be 4 somewhere along the line. 22 cents, I think, and I don't know about the shipment to Weesport. I'm sorry, Weesport? Shipment to Old Forge. Those people who have enough gray hair in here may remember the days when colleges had no coin-operated machines. If you wanted your laundry done, you sent it home. How'd you get it home? You mailed it. You had special boxes. You mailed it in, and then you got them back. The college towns had the biggest Post Express place to put the things. They're heaped to the ceiling back in those days. So this wasn't Chester's problem. But mailing of laundry was not an unusual thing at that time, not as unusual as we would think today. So they did start out, finally. Where'd that go? I meant to bring a brush marker here, but we'll do it here. It went from Utica all the way up the line past Fulton Sheen, which now is called Bandera, for those who know the region. Big move, road open. George finally to Tupper Lake. You cross the northern end of Herkimer County. This boy who'd never been on the train there didn't know where he was going, I don't think. And he knew it was lake country, and he apparently wanted the lake. But every time he'd see a lake, there was no rail station. When you see a rail station that sounded as if it were a lake, there was no lake to be seen. This is very common, still is. People go up there by car and find the old rail stations. They had to put them where the railroad was, and the railroad had to go where the engineering said it made sense. And what they did was end up by 5 o'clock or so in Tupper Lake. And I think by the time Chester looked down and saw Tupper Lake was no vacation lake. It was full of booms of logs and French-Canadian lumbermen and God knows what else. So they got a laundry room, a hotel room, and spent the night. And when they ate in the dining room, everybody saw, at least they appeared as witnesses later, that she was crying. In the morning, walking down, she following behind him, crying, to go to the buckboard that took them down to the rail station several miles away. On the way back, down the see if I got anything in here. On the way down, I had to picture 2 postcards somewhere. I don't know where they are. If you run into them, let me know. Yes, sir. That's 2 cents for each postcard. I thought I ran through them here. Don't worry about it. We'll dig it out. Chester and Grace got out their postcards they had bought the night before, or on the train going from one station to another, right back down the line they'd been on the day before, but backwards. And Chester grabbed his postcard and he wrote in the margin in pencil, so it's almost on the cycle. Okay, there we are. There are the 2 postcards, one against the other. The one in front with the lake view, that's the one of some lake south of Utica. It has nothing to do with the Adirondacks. All he was doing was writing in here something that says, and it was addressed to, I think, his cousin, one level up, who was treasurer or paymistress. Please send $5 to me Friday, or Friday, at Eagle Bay. I don't think he even knew where Eagle Bay was. It's something he heard from those 2 girls, I think. The one behind is her postcard, and it plays no part in this. He didn't even ask her if she's ready to mail it. They're at a stop at Brandeis or one of these places. He gets off down the train, walks down the platform to the mail car. That's an institution we don't have anymore. Trains with mail cars. There's a whole post office going on inside. This one is from Malone to Utica. Going up, it's Utica to Malone. And they've got bags of mail there. They're sorting mail, putting them in bags. Every town they come to, they throw down the mail bag and take another one of outgoing coming up. And there's quite a system in those days. And he went down there and mailed that card. This one right here. This is a picture of it, of course. And they took it. And there are people who don't believe he could do that. I'll never forget, Tupper Lake is still in my mind. My father once said, "Joe, you want to take a ride?" Boy, that was great to have my father ask something like that. I said, "Sure." "Where are you going?" I said. "We got to go to a post office. It's income tax day, 15th of March. In those days it was March. And why do we use the post office here? Well, it's closed. Saturday. Well, what about the one in Star Lake? That's closed too. Well, where are we going? Tupper Lake. He and a bunch of other people were waiting for that mail car to come through so they could mail the things and get them stamped with the right date and the right hour. So such things existed. So this time, he got off at Big Moose Station, which is several miles, 2 or 3 miles at least, if not 4, from the lake of that name, Big Moose Lake. And they took a horse and wagon. They took a horse and wagon into Big Moose Lake. For people who know topographic maps, this is old stuff. For the rest of you, probably is not. Well, I'm glad to have him around.
We are too.
This is typical of those lakes, but today you can drive into it by car. Back then, you were lucky to get off the train, which is somewhere off in the margin to the left, and come in that road there, and the red circle indicates where the hotel was. It's gone now. Most Adirondack hotels mysteriously burned down just before their insurance ran out. At least so the story goes in each case. And what was located at the end of that red, or into that red circle, or in that red circle, is a rather typical Adirondack hotel, the Glenmore. And yes, it has 2 N's in the name. Chester wasn't in the least bit interested in the desk. There you can find the length of the time. Look at the length. You can see some of them in shoes, which means they laxed it enough to walk down here to the lake, which is about down here. And then they could have concrete walk to come back on. It was a convenient hotel for the elderly, at least. There wasn't much to do. There was no television to watch. You could sit on a rocking chair and watch the lake. That was the biggest thing they had in those days. He wanted to go on the steamboat. There was a little putt-putt steamboat that took the mail around to camps on the shore. And he got talked out of it. They said, the steamboat isn't going to leave until a little while, and then you won't be back in time for dinner, meaning the midday meal. So what else is there? Well, we could rent a mailboat or a rowboat. So Chester rented him a rowboat. And he had to sign a log of some sort in order just to make the rental official. This is what he wrote. That's his handwriting. The choice of things to say is odd, to say the least. Well, his using a pseudonym is, he's been doing that in hotels with her anyway, always John Doe plus wife. But this time, what's the problem? He doesn't want to be known as Chester Gillette. But he wants her to be known by name and address. The district attorney made a ball out of this one. This is what the lake looked like, and it was not my photograph. It is from an old postcard of those days, taken from a top window in the hotel. Pretty lake, about 4 miles long and long east-west direction, and about at its widest point about a mile east north-south. Guess what got found here on the floor? There's that map where Chester lived with his The boat didn't come back. They didn't worry too much about it that night. Boats frequently stopped at a camp somewhere and people got put up and they had a meal and became friends and that sort of thing. But next morning it didn't reappear either. So they got the steam up in the steamboat. They lit off the boiler and took with them not only the captain of the steamboat, they didn't have crew much more than 2. And the young man who was 12 or 13 years old, Kirby. And they looked around the lake, and then somebody was rowing across the lake north-south, spotted a boat upside down in South Bay. So they went into South Bay, which is this little place here, and they found the boat upside down, and Roy spotted in the water beneath something white, which turned out to be her gown, whatever it was. I might put in something I missed a few minutes ago. When they got into the boat after signing out for it, he put her in the stern as a passenger. That's the way the movies have always done it since. And he put his suitcase on the deck right in front of her with a tennis racket strapped to the side, which seems like an oddity if ever there were oddities. Well, the boat was there, but no suitcase, no companion. The next morning the coroner came, a local coroner I guess, and they noticed some mandible damage, and he called his friend the district attorney down in the county seat and said, the most important thing is we can't find her companion. District attorney raised his head. You can't? You've looked? And at this point I have to pause and say that the district attorney went immediately to get a couple of sheriff's deputies and started his own police investigation. Now, it's just as a side story, he happened to be running for office in November, which might have made something about all of this publicity understandable. He was running for judge. Well, that had a few complications, but not many. He became the newsman's best friend for the rest of the summer. What he had, like these signatures and the like, he let the verbiage out to all of the men, all the newsmen, and at least one newswoman who was raising hell within her profession. But that's not a story to take time on. They arrested him. First they had to find him. The district attorney and his 2 deputies went to, of course, to Utica, because that's where you had to change trains to get to the northern train. It was the middle of the night train, and there was nobody around at midnight hours. A few people in the lobby. And one young man turned up and asking what was wrong, and normally they brush such an inquiry off, but they happened to mention that he was from Cortland. That's where she'd been working. So they wagged him over, and did he know Billy Brown? Oh yes, she works in the same place I do. Oh, do you know Chester Gillette? Oh yeah, I know him too. We'd like to know where Chester is now. And darned if he didn't fish into his pocket and pull out that postcard that had been sent to the treasurer or the paymistress right in the factory building. And they read on it, send me so and so. So that they immediately got on the train, but not before the DA hadn't talked to the management of the railroad and made sure that they would let him off at 2 unlisted stops if he needed to. And it's a good thing he did. He got as far as what is now Thendera, and one of the local workers pointed out that yesterday a package of laundry came through that is to be sent to Old Forge. Take one deputy, send him to Old Forge, watch for it. See who asks for it, and follow him. Then he took the other deputy, and Fred Gross, the boy that was with him, young man with him, he took him along too, since he was heading for the Adirondacks anyway. He got off at Eagle Bay on the little side railroad, the one that goes to went to Racket Lake. He must have commandeered the thing, because there was no schedule there. And we got off at Eagle Bay, went into the post office and said, "Do you have any mail for Chester Gillette?" The poor post office man was just opening his eyes, I think. He said, "No, but I got mail from him yesterday." Mail from him? He went out and found another postcard that said, "Please forward any mail that comes for me at Eagle Bay to Arrowhead Hotel across the water." Just a short hop. But next to there, on the length of the last stop, the Arrowhead dock was the last stop going up that lake. They had it, and they went racing over there on Saturday morning, and there was Chester eating his breakfast as calm as could be. He'd been having a good time talking to a minister's daughter. And he'd gone looking on Black Bear Mountain the previous day. Hadn't seen the other girls though, but he was sort of disappointed. Now the disappointment time was over. They had him. They wanted a murder charge. They took him down by the steamboat to Old Forge, passing the other steamboat coming up with the laundry. They made a little switch there. Got to Old Forge and properly arraigned him within the county where the crime occurred. And that was pretty much it. He was in jail from that point on. And all summer they waited for a trial and waited for a trial. And trials were slow coming. One thing that occurred that summer, which is not a legal thing as much, it is just a bit of family feeling and family history. There's a picture of the six, including the parents, of Chester's family. Chester being this one back here. This one here is his next older sister, the next younger child. And at this time, in the summer of 1906, she was in New York State, working in New York City somewhere. What she was doing, I have no idea. But the mother, who had been behind so many things, there in the middle of the bottom, she had problems because she didn't know where Chester was at first. And then when she found the address for the jail, she didn't know what he was in for. So she sent him a letter. Well, they didn't give him the letter in the jail. They opened it and copied it by typewriter, with not very good typing, and then gave him the letter itself. It tells a little bit about his mother, and it might imply something about his youth if he grew up under this kind of umbrella. "My dear darling boy," this is from Denver. She had left the Zion Faith Healing Group and gone to Denver. I don't know why. "Oh, that I could take you in my arms this afternoon as I did when you were a babe, and have the whole of your babyhood and your boyhood to live over again. I might do better than I've done, I might not, but oh, I want you, my boy, just as you are today. I love you no matter what you have done. A mother's love never fails. The tears fall so fast I can hardly write." Hazel has written 3 letters on jumping and aroused our worst fears, but told us nothing of the deed. She wants to know why he's in jail. Nobody has told her. And to read the stories of that time, it could be found in a good many newspapers in the United States. I don't know about Denver. Oh, this is terrible. I suppose you've stolen money from Uncle Horace and that you were in jail in New York City, but no, nothing. Do write us and tell us what it's all about and how it happened. I expect we'll hear tomorrow and next day from Horace. I have no hope of getting the facts from Hazel. She only writes in the last over and over again, do not worry. Poor Hazel, the girl, was kind of caught in the middle. I suspect you were asking yourself this question over and over again now that your sin has found you out. The only answer is sin, 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 all underlined. Sin did it, and I did not control it. And that's about all that's worth pumping out of that, except that she says to him, I know your weakest point. You've done this before. And apparently it was stealing money. But when and from whom, I don't know. It could have been back in the Salvation Army days when he got his hand in the pot. Or it could have been when he was at prep school at Oberlin, where we know very little about what happened or why the college wouldn't take him back. I wish I could have seen a copy of the return letter from the professor she wrote to, with a snide little remark that maybe if he hadn't been absent that spring this wouldn't have happened. It's very difficult. Anyhow, the trial went on, and we'll abbreviate things like crazy because I have no watch and I'm a little afraid to know what the time is. He went to trial during November, just before Thanksgiving. They set a trial date in Albany, but very carefully made sure that it came after the election. He won, by the way. No problem. And this could go on until Christmas time, if need be, but then when they put the new judge in, but they got rid of it in about two and a half weeks. And the description of the trial in the courthouse, there was somewhere around here a picture of the courthouse, but I don't think it's worth breaking out now. The courthouse at that time had the trial courtroom on the second floor, full width of the building, wall to wall, with a balcony. The news kept saying they could get 1,000 people in there. And people found out the demand for seats was so great that what they did was to ultimately, after the first day or two, they'd bring their lunch as a bag lunch. Then after the fourth or fifth day, the judge got tired of smelling what was going on in the room, and he put a stop to it and had all the windows open at noon, and that was that. Chester even spoke in his own defense, but he didn't get anywhere. He had different kinds of stories. And the only thing that stood most outstanding in his defense was that there was no witness to what happened. Nobody knows what went on outside in that water. He left quite a trail of evidence working up to it. But what he'd done is walk away and take his own name. When he was in the Arrowhead Hotel in the next town up, he used his own name again, figuring everything's wiped out now. So it was a difficult one, and ultimately the word came down that this, my goodness, where did these come from? Were these hiding too? These are would-be postcards that I would take. I would have had one in my pocket, pull it out and say, just as the young, what's his name, did. They brought in all kinds of documents. The most not the noisiest, but the most popular thing among many people was when the district attorney brought in all of those letters which they found that she had written him in the drawer of a bureau in East Main Street where he roomed, and presented them as an exhibit. The defense attorneys jumped up screaming complaint, and instead the judge finally decided, I don't know where he dreamed this up, it would be all right to use them to show, only to show the relationship between the two before the death. If you can keep one from the other there, I guess you're doing very well, but I wouldn't be able to. So half a dozen away at one time. The letters were read, including the one or two I had a portion out of. The most famous became her last letter. This is page 1. There were 6 pages. That's page 1. And you can find, if you went down through here, you could find that first person pronoun here and there, all over the place. And they found him guilty. The newspaper stories were plastered all over the United States. This is where the wire services really came into their own. They had 2 telegraphers, one from Postal Telegraph and the other from Western Union, at the bottom of the stairs going up to that courtroom. Little messengers would run back and forth with things to be sent back to newspapers. Something I would like to bring up here. Chester's middle initial was E. Nobody ever asked about it, although sometimes they spelled it out. His name was Ellsworth, Chester Ellsworth. Now we run into Ellsworth somewhere else. If I have the list out, his uncle was named Ellsworth Porter, his youngest uncle. Ellsworth Porter Gillette. So he was named, his middle name came from an uncle. That's not unusual, except that what is unusual and worth mentioning as an aside is that the uncle was born in 1861 in the summertime. That is the year the Civil War really started. In the month of May, Virginia withdrew from the Union, the biggest and most powerful southern state. And it sort of cemented the Confederacy as an entity, but at that time, Lincoln had a visitor in the White House, Colonel Ellsworth, who was colonel of a, I can't remember the name for it, ragtag is not it. They wore strange French desert uniforms.
Zouaves.
Zouaves, yes. And they didn't wear them in battle very often, but they were parade uniforms. He and Lincoln knew each other from the days of law, and he was born, I think, near Mechanicsville, New York, so which sort of makes him one of us. And he noticed, or was told, that right across the river, what is it, Alexandria? The very nearest city in Virginia, some hotel owner had gone up on the peak of his roof and put up the biggest Confederate flag you could imagine. Stars and bars, not the battle flag they talk about so much today. So he went over there with I'd call it a patrol of his own men, pickups mostly. Though the oddity is the one corporal in the group's name was Brownell, and where he came from, I don't know. I wouldn't have related to the Civil War. My great-grandfather ducked out of it. He was too old or too young or something. And he marched with his men up the stairs to the top of that roof and tore down the stars and bars and was carrying it downstairs when the hotel owner was coming up with a double-barrel shotgun. Shot him dead. Corporal Brownell shot the hotel owner dead. Both in the North and in the South, they tended to make great propaganda sympathy messages out of these 2 deaths, each in an opposite direction, of course. And that summer, more people got caught up in the spirit in the North than they had during the firing on Fort Sumter, which was sort of an institutional thing. Here were 2 human beings, and In this case, Ellsworth died, and there were a lot of baby Ellsworths that summer. And my guess is that's how the Gillettes got into the act. Chester was sent to Auburn prison for more than a year while they waited to the appeal, which failed. His mother went to Albany, and apparently the stories vary, tried to talk the governor into release, and according to one story, probably hers, had him down on his knees, but I doubt that very much. He later became Chief Justice of the United States. Chester today is somewhere in that shadow. There was a sensitive era when they didn't particularly mark graves because they feared that political implications would come out. This is just in the shadow of the assassination of an American president less than 10 years before. And they didn't want anybody trying to either move a body or desecrate a grave or anything. So they're awfully sensitive. They still won't tell you which, there's a number to the grave. They'll tell you they don't know the numbers anymore. I don't believe that. Grace lies in a little cemetery on the edge of South Otselic. Somebody in town or some group keeps decorating the grave every year. It always looks neat. Who are these people we've been looking at? Well, one's Grace and one's Chester. You can't miss them very much, I guess. They are who they are. The picture on the bottom is nothing but the end of the story I said I'd get to finally here, in that if nothing else had occurred, this would be dead issue. You'd have to go to the internet to find out what this death was in the first place. But 20 years after the event, possibly 21, Theodore Dreiser, then a famous novelist in the United States, brought out a book called An American Tragedy. He had changed the name of every person, if he kept the person at all, changed the name of every town and place and moved them. He didn't change major cities, which played no part in it. He didn't change the name of the Mohawk River. That's where he moved the factory town to, which is a little bit odd, but I guess he was trying to keep something going. Then in 1931, they brought out a black and white movie, one of the early talkies with that same title. And Paramount got sued by Mrs. Gillette, Mrs. Brown, because the movie had made her family look like a bunch of hicks. And this might be too difficult to probe, to use as a political tool, as a legal tool in the courtroom, except that when the movie came out, it was shown in the movie theater in Norwich, which is their county seat. And when they did, apparently they took old newspapers or reproductions of them, of the real movie, and plastered them up and down the outside of the entryway. And this was a way of making a plea to the court that they owed something because they were linked in one way or another with the actual crime. Another thing. We're down to the last 2 or 3 things. You'd be glad to know. Now, in actuality, the book, An American Tragedy, has no Chester Gillette. It has, I think, a Clyde Griffith or something like that. I think they kept the initials. Do you suppose that on the first page of the book you could find Chester Gillette or Clyde Griffith in a book? I'm gonna pick on this one. He's helped me enough today, I owe him something. See if you can find it. I have a hard time telling which is the first book and which is the second. They come in two volumes.
It's a book that appears to be in Chinese.
Is Chinese. So in one way, our story got out all over the world. And some of those books in that picture up there, which I covered up, they don't show up too well in this shot. But they come in all languages, and I've sort of collected them, but I've quit collecting. It's too much of a notion. I've got one in German, one in Norwegian, book one only, one in Romanian, one in Chinese. There's got to be another one or two somewhere I've forgotten about. But if one is to say that Cortland made it internationally, this is one way of doing it, but it was fiction. Every one of these things is fiction, including the one you've got. Fiction based upon actual facts and events and actual people, but it's slightly tuned. If they did it today as a movie again, they'd have helicopters and space needles and everything else. Well, I think I've run the course pretty dry by now. You've been a wonderful audience. Any questions?
Do you want me to repeat them for you? Do you want me to repeat the questions for you? As we discuss?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, if you have a question, I'll repeat it because we're taping this and we want to get the question so that it can be heard up on the tape. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Where is Chester buried?
Where is Chester buried?
I've forgotten the name of it. It's like Aurora or something like that. A cemetery on the northeastern corner of Auburn, I think just over the city limits, beyond the city. But it's a relatively rural site.
Probably is Aurora.
Aurora?
Aurora, there is a village of Aurora outside of
Oh,
Auburn.
that could be. I don't know for certain. Could
But
be.
I'll tell you that it looked like the Fort Hill Cemetery. I'm from Auburn, and that cemetery looked very much like Fort Hill.
I don't think so.
Cemetery.
I've been there 3 or 4
Okay.
times. But... Yes.
Dr. Brownell, how did you get involved in this story?
How did you get involved in this story?
I don't know. I was born 35 miles to the west, but I wasn't paying much attention at that time. And when I grew up in Oswegatchie, which was always the summer abode, people would say, we don't have the right map on there, but people would say that, we're not going to either, I'm not going to worry about it. I would hear the older people, not my parents' generation, they were 6 or 7 years old when it happened. But my grandparents' generation, who got all their news by newspapers. There was no radio, no television, and it was newspapers. And the women in the family got more interested in what was going on than my grandfather, who thought it was a lot of bunk. And, so there is a place in that book when it comes out again. I want to make sure it stays in. I just identify him as a rural farmer up in St. Lawrence County, 3 miles out of town. The women leaned on him so hard for the news of that day of the trial, because every day had news of the trial. He walked the 3 miles to get a newspaper and walked back. I know what that walk is like because I've done it for school. But, yeah, it's something about the scale of it in time and the scale of it in geography. Both. Some stay the same over the years and some things change over the years. Yes.
Can you summarize, like, what was the impact of the murder and its aftermath on the Gillette family business and the family in Cortland? There was notoriety, were they, disowned or chastised? How was the family treated?
Without knowing specifically on all those points, I would say that probably there was impact. Mr. Gillette himself sent a friend up to, in fact, I think it was a cousin, a jeweler in town, up to, when Chester was in jail, to scout the territory. It began to look as if he thought the guy was innocent, he'd jump in and help. If he didn't, he wouldn't. He didn't. He sort of left him stranded. And during the era of the execution, did I show that execution sketch up there? Just didn't explain it. You don't need an explanation, really, except that the guy wasn't in the room to make the sketch while it went on. They didn't allow newsmen in. I'm not sure during that period of time when the execution would take place, I think Mr. Gillette took a round-the-world cruise by steamship. So that kind of impact occurred. There was another one which impacted locals in that I could never get the Browns to talk. There was Ruby Brown, the youngest sister, was living right up in DeRuyter. I laid my groundwork so carefully. I found a widow in town who was the widow of a banker. And we had coffee over her breakfast table and we talked and talked, trying to point it out to her that these people are not talking. And I found out later the reason the Browns weren't talking is that Mrs. Brown, the widow, or the mother, later sued Paramount Pictures. And the rest of the family thought that was a terrible thing to do just for money. Well, this one gal, I shouldn't call her a gal. They tell me I call women girls and I shouldn't. I don't call them boys. But where was I heading?
The one who talked to you, I think.
I got to the first. I got to the one who wouldn't.
Right.
Or rather, I didn't get. We spent an hour at least pointing out how simply carefully we must be in approaching Ruby, because she's going to turn you down at first, even if she thinks she knows what you're talking about, asking about. And by the time I drove home to Cortland, the phone was ringing and it was my friend at the coffee table saying she'd already been over there and turned down. I thought this would go on for some weeks, slowly and gently. Didn't work out that way. I did have one other thing that worked very well, perhaps more by mistake than anything else. All of the Browns stayed pretty local with one exception. And I've got pictures of every gravestone of the family somewhere. I lose things, as you can see. When Mrs. Brown died in about 1938, they had a note in I think the Norwich paper, telling which children were there, which ones couldn't be, and so forth. And one of them was Mary Landesman. Well, Mary was the next younger sister and very unusually close to Grace. But she married somebody named Landesman, and they didn't stay long in the area, they went. Now she's there, back there, Mary Landesman of Detroit. So I went down to the library, which in those days, pre-internet, had every telephone book in the country, it would seem. Pulled down Detroit, couldn't find a Landesman. I was about to leave and I thought, I've got a daughter living down near Toledo. Toledo is awfully close to Detroit. I'll try that. Opened up Toledo and there was one Landesman. I've got to still remain very careful. I don't want to shut somebody off, shut somebody down. So I concocted a letter. boy concocted a situation and wrote a very carefully written letter. I didn't mail it for days. To this person in Toledo, saying that I've been looking for the place where Mr. and Mrs. Landisman are buried. Well, I'll be firm. And sure enough, a few days later, a letter came back. He was 90-some years old, which in those days I thought was old. I'm too close to that now. And he said, yes, she was my, how'd they go? He was my brother. And he'd done very well in being an inspector of clothes for the Army in World War I or something like that. They're dead now, and I think the best source to find out where they were buried would be either of his daughters. One's in Miami, one's up in Detroit. I chose Detroit. So wrote a letter to her, very guarded, very careful again, scared to be kicked out before I got in. And she wrote back and had her telephone number at the top of the page. So I thought, gee, that's a better nudge than anything. I called her on the telephone, my pencil and paper out, ready to go. And she said, what's your telephone number? I gave it. She says, hang up, I'll call you. I don't believe this. I don't believe it at all. She called me and we talked, and next time I put a tape recorder on with her permission, and I have a long log of these things. Found out about several things and that people wonder about. Did the family, for example, understand why Grace was home during that leave? No, they didn't. She pulled it off very well, as long as she could, but it was only going to be a matter of time before it showed physically. And from there, and the same problem, kind of sensitive subject, I don't want to get into it, but it deals with the question that arose after the whole escapade was over. How does a girl who is normal, a woman of age, make it all sound bad? 20-year-old woman get by for over a month without having some indication of monthly discharge? Good question. Things weren't in those days the way they are now. In those days they had every month or two they'd stir up a huge kettle at steaming water, and in would go a whole bunch of old cloths and rags. And then they get dried off and used again. Nobody saw her do anything different than usual, even to the point where some of them suspected that she had come deliberately dirtied a piece of cloth and thrown it in. Who knows? I'm out of my territory and things like this. As to the succeeding generations, remember that picture of the oldest daughter on the one side of the line there? Her granddaughter got a lot of the documents back up north where they belong, that is in the library where they can be studied. And I'm very happy she did. She's very good at email, and actually the last thing I got from her was through the postal mail. And the other one that has been helpful has been, they both come from the same city out of no good reason. Almost all of the NH's great-grandchildren now live on the West Coast, one place or another. These two that I mentioned are different. They live in Tallahassee, Florida, a city I don't even know. And the one almost brought her picture today just for fun, but I didn't. She is a very good genealogist, and she is one who typed up Horace's diary that he kept in different areas. She typed it up all from the handwritten stuff. To me, it's invaluable. I keep it in my Gillette box. These present Gillettes are so far away from this that it is only a curiosity to them anyway. They are the nicest people I think I've ever met. And Chester was, I'm tempted to say an oddball or the odd man out or something, but he thought he was smart doing some of the things he did, but it's so transparent when you look back at it. Any other questions? Okay, a nice day having you here. I wish you could say the same about me. Lean on an elbow to speak to people, that's not gracious at all.
Thank you, sir.